Okay, good morning, everybody. Looks like we've got two things on the agenda for today's meeting. So, Stephen, do you want to take us away?
Yeah, so I've been working on the 1.24 performance page to update those numbers, and the page is a little bit underwhelming, especially when you compare it to the Linkerd one. So I was gonna propose just adding like a few more metrics, like not that much, hopefully to make it feel a bit more fleshed out. Specifically, I was thinking we could do performance at kind of lower queries per second, so like maybe 20. That's what Linkerd does. And we could also do like max as like hit it as hard as we can and see how many requests per second or queries per second it can handle. And I just wanted to get people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about 20 QPS. So you just end up with obscene amounts of noise, right? I mean, the more traffic you send, the more normalized the metrics are, right?
Okay.
So I'd be worried. I mean, maybe you can fix it by running it for a long time, but then you have to run it for like an hour.
Yeah.
And if you only have 20 QPS, I don't know that you really care. I mean, we're recording. The Linkerd page is not inspirational. I'll put it that way. Their numbers are made up kind of in some of the stuff. So I mean, we can make some changes. We just need to be mindful of what are good changes, because we also don't want to add. At one point, we actually had more data. We had like 15 different runs of all these different modes, and it was just confusing for users, and it was really slow to run to forever. So, I mean, the one thing really is like these are synthetic benchmarks. So the benchmark shows like, I don't know what, an app that has like 0.1 millisecond latency, and then Istio adding like 0.6 milliseconds on top of it or something. Like there's no real world application where that's in any way what their application looks like, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know that we need to get too crazy. I think really the key point of the benchmark is to show that, look, the overhead of the sidecar is really not that high in typical case, which I feel like we do kind of convey pretty well. Now, there's also a difference between what we publish on like the mainline Istio.io and what we run ourselves internally to track regressions and improvements and whatnot. There's a lot more motivation to have different use cases, so we make sure like, hey, we didn't go make our throughput with 57 OTC policies and 10,000 endpoints in the service slower, right? But having all that presented to the user is probably overkill. And I'm not saying we shouldn't add anything, just less is more on user-facing docs. And specifically on the Linkerd thing, I don't like their CPU and memory part, by the way. The latency, I don't know, I didn't reproduce it, but at least not obviously wrong.
Okay, so is you're saying that we should just keep it kind of what it's like right now, where it's just pretty simple, like it doesn't make that big of a difference?
I mean, I'm fine tweaking things. I'm not like tied to what we have now. I just don't want to go add a bunch of stuff. Definitely not copying like some of the stuff.
Yeah.
D1. Like for example, we have like right now we have the x-axis is connections, and there's no change with the number of connections. So it kind of begs the question, why are we graphing it, right? If we really want to go the less is more approach, you just turn that into pick one amount of connections and just show a bar chart. Or if you want to put more stuff, you can strip out that as an x-axis and put something else on the x-axis or something. Then we're still presenting the same amount of info, but it's more useful or something maybe. Yeah, all sorts of options. I really don't have a super strong preference as long as we're presenting, meaningful data that's understandable to users and doesn't overwhelm them. So.
Okay, gotcha. So maybe add some stuff, but not too much or very little.
We do definitely want to add the ambient layer 1, layer 7 number. I think, Stephen, you got that, right?
Yeah, that's on there.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
the number we had on preliminary was wrong. I guess we published on Istio too. The sidecar number was very, like the latency was too high if you compare with the previous one. So
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to bring up just for me was I had a lot of trouble finding like how those tests they run, where they run, just both in the docs and in general, because the current like performance tests don't support ambient mode without you having to like go in a little bit. So if anybody knows where that script is hiding, please let me know. And also, it would be great if I could have access to the CNCF hardware so that I could run the tests not in AKS or a local kind cluster.
yeah, I can give you access to the environment. Can you maybe Slack me your SSH public key? I will add you. As far as the script, my understanding is, I'm not sure if it's in GitHub. I know Shuyab, he was our intern. He ran the number last time. So I think it's on that machine for sure, which you can probably tell from like the past commands. I don't know if he put in GitHub. It probably was nag him to ask him to put in GitHub somewhere. And my understanding is the plot you might have to generate manually for ambient. So it's worthwhile looking at some automation for the graph, generating the graph. I don't think he got it generated automatically. But I can definitely give you access to the environment because the environment is empty most of it. It's not being used most of the time. It's pretty wasteful. So,
okay, thank you. I'll follow up with that after this. That's it for me.
Yeah, thank you so much actually for looking at this. I really appreciate it, Stephen.
Yeah, by the way, one thing. Oh, sorry, Mitch, go ahead.
I'm just going to say getting like meaningful and informative graphs on real world test scenarios that are likely going to be similar to what our customers or users experience in production is very, very valuable and is data that today is very hard to find. So I'm excited to see this improve.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing, like don't take my comments to mean like, oh, it's already good how it is and we shouldn't improve it. The testing is, I would say it's actually, and one of the hardest things I think of joining a new project is understanding what's bad and what's good and what's bad, but not going to change. The testing is in the bad category. It's constantly kind of a thing that gets churned out where someone works on it for 3 months and then moves on. So it's never really been in a good state. So definitely tons of room for improvement there and happy to see someone taking that on.
Okay, so, but going back to what Mitch said, do you think it'd be valuable to like come up with some like real use test cases and put them on there? Or is that more of like a maybe in the future we can do that as opposed to the 1.24? Because I think that'd be cool too, but it might be a topic of more discussion.
Well, you can always become more real world.
Oh yeah.
So there's a threshold that we need. But for instance, looking at that other website you sent that had a test of 20 QPS, that's not a realistic load for a service mesh. If you have a cluster doing only 20 RPS, you really don't need a service mesh or something like that. It's serious overkill. So making sure that the dimensions that we do have in our test are realistic for a real world scenario. I wouldn't want to say like, oh, let's build a whole new book info with checkout carts and persistent databases, because those are all real world things. Eventually it gets overly complicated and you get diminishing returns. But basic things like how much load does it need to handle? How many services and how many instances behind those services? I think those are very valid questions for us to ask and to make sure that we're giving customers results that are realistic for them to likely expect when they go to production.
Okay, so just be mindful of that kind of stuff, of what might be expected and what is not.
Yeah, so for instance, like one that I've seen very commonly is like a test that only involves one client and one service. That's interesting and it's a good benchmark for us to have. We should keep doing that. But as far as setting expectations with customers, it's not a very good test scenario.
Okay.
Instead, having effectively a mesh of services, I wonder where that name came from, that are calling each other and composing results together the way that BookInfo does, or if you've used like the isotope test harness, we can do that there as well. We have mechanisms for doing that. Just want to make sure that we continue with real world like scenarios where possible.
Okay. Yeah, don't use BookInfo. Do you mind if I reach out after this? Or maybe we can talk about it here of more specifically. I'm just thinking because right now what I do have is a client test, and I'm just wondering like how I could make it more realistic in like a way that's not like building an app, as you said, of having like much more services, because I feel like you hit diminishing returns like pretty quickly. So if you could just point me in like, I still look forward to one or two ways of I could do it beyond just like a client server running for you, as we have right now. Yes,
I can definitely do that. Isotope is an old tool. It's not been touched in a long time, although I've been playing with it a little bit recently. And what you can do is use a YAML file to define a mesh of services. So service A calls service B returns a 1 kilobyte payload after sleeping for 300 milliseconds. Service C maybe is involved in the mesh somehow and has a 20% error rate. So you can define each of these services and how they relate to one another in a mesh. And Isotope will generate all of those HTTP or gRPC servers on your behalf and run them in Kubernetes. So I'll share a link with you, and then happy to help with any questions you have along the way.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the feedback, everybody.
Cool. Eric, circuit breakers?
Yes. Hey, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to reopen a discussion around a PR I submitted back in May or June, I think, around exposing the Envoy retry budget circuit breaker threshold and Istio destination rule. And just for context, at my company right now, we're trying to standardize our circuit breaker configuration across hundreds of services. And we found that because retry budget is a dynamic configuration that sets a threshold on concurrent retries based off of the total active requests for a service, we found it's performed better than setting a static retry threshold. And it's also easier because it's pretty difficult to find a threshold, a static threshold for concurrent retries that fits, all of our services. And I specifically wanted to discuss something from the discussion in that PR around exposing retry budgets through virtual service versus destination rule. And I was actually hoping to share my screen if possible.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, awesome, thank you.
While you're doing that, Eric, I want to say thank you for joining the meeting and reaching out and being active in the community. We want many, many more users like you. So really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I had to change some system setting to be able to share my screen here. Okay. All right, can you guys see?
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah. So if I find the PR here, yeah, the point that came up that, oh wait, is this not the right PR? Sorry, I just needed to find the right one. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so John, you made this point here about exposing retry budget in virtual service so as not to split up the configuration on retries. And I found that a little bit confusing. I'll explain why, because retry budget is a circuit breaker threshold. And typically all of these circuit breaker thresholds are exposed here within destination rule. And these circuit breaker thresholds are for maximum concurrent retries. I thought it would be more confusing to have this exposed within HTTP retry, because typically here you're specifying the total number of retries allowed per request. And this is also configured per route. So I just think that the semantics of where we're currently exposing all circuit breaker thresholds makes a bit more sense within destination role. And yeah, I was just interested in maybe starting more of a discussion on this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's a few things. I think we were saying it definitely is not crazy, but at the very least, like it definitely makes sense. So to give the other context, one, I don't know that I fully rationalized how like the whole max retries and connection pool when I had made these comments. Or I don't remember, it was a while ago. Maybe I did.
Yeah.
But also like, so in my mind, it was like, okay, retries are on virtual service. I know that Envoy puts it in one place. The attempt is ignore what Envoy does, think about what is the right thing to do, and then work on how we can do it from there. Because oftentimes what we do is we look at what Envoy does and say, okay, we're going to copy paste that into here. We're good to go. And now we're the Envoy API, not Istio. And that's not a problem, because it's not that we can't have anything that Envoy does, but Envoy is not meant for humans. It's meant for Istio developers who have to understand how Envoy works.
Yeah.
Now, the further wrench in the discussion is the whole gateway API, where they're looking to expose this specific setting. And I don't know, Mike, who is looking like he's going to talk soon, can tell us more, but at least at some point in time, it looked like they were going to put on route. And if they were to put it on route and we only had it on destination role, it becomes very challenging for us to implement. So, and it's possible we could have it on two places potentially, but then you have to figure out like how do you handle it being in both places.
Yeah.
Maybe Mike can update us on where the gateway API is at, or whatever else you want to say, Mike.
Yeah. So update from the gateway API side is that we're adding the typical like the max count retries to the gateway API spec on HTTP route in the upcoming 1.2 release, which should be out in a couple weeks, I think. I had originally intended this to also include support for budgeted retries. That ended up getting cut from the scope just due to time constraints. But I still expect that it is something we will eventually add. Tentatively, we're thinking in the same place. So also on HTTP route, just as a like additional configuration method on that. But there was some discussion of that in I think it was the implementation PR or the GET PR. But it's definitely something that we've considered, and I think that is the most likely place it would still end up in Gateway API.
Okay. Yeah, I know you're trying to balance between like the semantics of multiple mesh like implementations, but I'm still just wondering if you think that might be a bit confusing from a UX perspective to have side by side like a static value of retries per request with a threshold for concurrency. I'm not sure like how other mesh implementations do it. I'm only familiar with Istio honestly, but yeah, that's just something that I was curious about.
Yeah, that's something that again was part of the like cut due to scope time frame constraints of like, yeah, taking a closer look at the UX there and really figuring out how do users expect this to work. Are these things that would ever be configured at the same time? Is it that you would configure one or the other? And then also looking at like usage patterns of, is it typical to configure this for a single service or route? Or are you configuring this in a way that you're trying to apply it to many different services. And yeah, like it's also weird thinking about it for like mesh traffic versus gateway ingress traffic, where the gateway ingress one is a little more straightforward scenario. So I don't have great answers yet.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and what we're struggling with right now as well, as far as doing this via an Envoy filter, is the fact that when we're building a service, this Envoy filter needs to be, or when we're building the manifest, excuse me, for a service, we also need to create this Envoy filter in the namespace of all of the clients of the service, and that adds some complexity there. And I think what we're wanting is the ability, with the ability to do this through destination rule, is just to configure this one time for a service. And yeah, so I think that was kind of our other concern there.
That makes sense to want to configure this one time, and then well, this is another part that maybe you have answers here from like the end user perspective that I was kind of confused about. But like in a traditional sidecar model, it's you have the mesh is aware of retry policy configured on destination, but you end up like implementing it through the client. You basically have like a smart client of some sort that knows I'm expecting it's okay to retry this once, twice, 3 times, or when I get certain responses. And that's sort of what you're saying of like you have to implement this through Envoy filters on the clients. I don't know how that works in like an ambient model. If that's like closer to the ingress model where like you implement it at the waypoint versus like whatever dumb client, for lack of a better term, is like calling the waypoint. And maybe John has thoughts on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would only be on the waypoint for sure in ambient. So it's now we technically have retries now on the inbound side.
Interesting.
But I don't know that ever makes sense for, well, I don't know how that interacts. Maybe we should follow up on that. I don't know. Sorry, that's going off topic.
We should figure this out. Yes.
Yeah, no worries. And I think the other thing too with setting retry budget on the virtual service is then you would have to do it per route, correct? And I think that might also be a little confusing from UX perspective, if I'm right there.
Yeah, I mean, you can set a default retry
yeah.
policy at the mesh level, but that applies everywhere. So
Okay.
Yeah, that is one of the constraints of the Gateway API model too. Is yeah, it's you have to configure it per HTTP route. Where if you have multiple HTTP routes pointing to the same backend, you have to configure it in multiple places.
Okay.
Versus something like a policy or destination rule style, where you would have it applied to the service, and then anything that is pointing to it or it should infer those routes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, I understand it's probably pretty difficult to plan this out as far as gateway API is concerned. I think I think we still might have like those concerns about how now you're mixing these the static limit per route on total retries with like the Envoy circuit breaker thresholds. But yeah, I understand that's kind of a difficult thing to make work, across different mesh implementations. But yeah, I just wanted to, maybe get more clarification and whatnot there, but I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And if you have interest in continuing to work on this, like I would love to kind of engage with you more deeply to figure out some of this. And as we kind of work towards where might this fit best and what does the UX look like ideally, and like what scenarios are you trying to apply this in?
Yeah, definitely. I would love to participate in that, and I think we could probably offer from my side maybe some more different perspectives within my company on the UX there, like how that might work for us. So
that would be wonderful.
Definitely.
I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
Eric, it's a sort of an interesting thing that so many of us get put in a place of responsibility for defining APIs that we've never really used or probably will never use. I've been working in service mesh for, I don't know how many years now, 6 or 7 years. I can't do math very well, but a long time. I've never operated one in production. So getting the perspective of someone who has, particularly right at this moment where we're looking at having an industry-wide definition for how this is done, is super, super valuable for us. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I'm happy I can participate.
All right, looking back at the agenda, those were the only 2 items we had. Did anyone else have any last minute items for us to discuss? All right, well, in that case, we can take a little bit of a break. The ambient meeting will start in about 30 minutes. See you then.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, y'all. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.